What Ferrari just discovered could force Formula One to rewrite its own rules, because Mercedes might have found a way to gain up to 40 extra horsepower without ever breaking a single regulation. And if that sounds impossible, it gets worse. This advantage may already be deciding races, championships, and millions in prize money. We're talking about a hidden performance gain worth tenths per lap, built into the one place no one was properly checking. And here's the part nobody expected. The FIA already inspected the engine and declared it completely legal. So how can something be legal and still completely change the competitive balance of a sport? Ferrari believes they've found the answer. And if they're right, then the first races of this season weren't just wins. They were built on something no other team could match. Subscribe now, because what comes next explains everything. Ferrari didn't find this by accident. This started months before the first race, before the cars were even assembled on track. Because in Formula One, the real battle doesn't begin on Sunday. It begins in silence, inside factories, behind closed doors, where engineers study numbers that don't lie, but don't always tell the full story either. And that's exactly where something felt wrong. When Ferrari's engineers analyzed Mercedes' engine data, they noticed something subtle. Not obvious, not dramatic, but precise enough to raise a red flag. The internal tolerances were too perfect, too controlled, too deliberate. And in this sport, that level of precision is never random. It's intentional, it's designed, and more importantly, it's hiding something. But here's where it gets interesting. Because nothing in the data directly broke the rules. Everything looked clean, measured, within limits. Exactly what the FIA would expect. And that's what made it dangerous. Because the most powerful advantages in Formula One are never the obvious ones. They're the ones that look legal until you understand how they behave under pressure. And Ferrari understood one critical detail. Engines don't operate on paper. They operate under extreme heat, extreme stress, extreme conditions. Conditions that change everything. This is where most people miss the real story. Because when we talk about engine performance, we think about design. We think about power. We think about speed. But the real key is behavior. How the engine changes once it's pushed to the limit. And Mercedes built something that doesn't just perform well. It evolves. At low temperatures during inspection, everything aligns perfectly with the rules. 16:1 compression. Exactly what's allowed. Nothing suspicious. But once that engine reaches race conditions, once temperatures rise, once materials begin to expand, the entire geometry of the engine shifts. Not randomly, not uncontrollably, but in a way that was clearly anticipated, clearly engineered. And suddenly, the engine is no longer operating at 16. It's operating at something higher, something the rules were designed to prevent. And here's the key detail most people don't realize. The FIA wasn't measuring that. They were checking the engine in conditions that don't exist during a race, which means Mercedes didn't need to cheat. They just needed to understand the gap between regulation and reality, and they exploited it perfectly. But this is where the tension really starts to build, because Ferrari didn't just suspect an advantage. They realized something much bigger. If this was true, then Mercedes wasn't just faster. They were playing a completely different game. And the worst part, they were doing it in plain sight. But here's where the story stops being just clever engineering and starts becoming a real threat to the entire grid. Because once Ferrari understood what Mercedes was doing, they asked a much more uncomfortable question. What happens if this is only the visible part? What if this isn't the advantage, but just the doorway to something bigger? And that's when other teams started looking closer. Honda, Audi, even engineers inside teams that weren't directly fighting Mercedes. They all saw the same pattern, and they all reached the same conclusion. This wasn't normal development. This was controlled behavior under heat, which means one thing. If you can control how materials expand, you can control how the engine performs dynamically. Not fixed, not predictable, but adaptable. And that changes everything. Because Formula One regulations are built around static limits, maximum values, defined numbers, clear boundaries. But Mercedes wasn't working with static conditions. They were working with transformation. An engine that behaves one way in the garage and another way on track. And suddenly, the entire concept of scrutineering starts to break down. Because how do you regulate something that changes depending on when you measure it? That's the question nobody wanted to answer. And yet, everyone in the paddock was already thinking it. Because if this concept works for compression, what else could it affect? Cooling, energy recovery, combustion efficiency. Every single system inside the power unit becomes a variable. And that's when the fear started to spread. Not publicly, not in interviews, but inside engineering meetings. Because this wasn't just about catching Mercedes. It was about understanding whether they had already gone further. And here's where things take another turn. Because after the first races, the data didn't just confirm the suspicion. It amplified it. Mercedes wasn't just fast. They were consistently pulling away in ways that didn't match normal gains. Not just on straights, not just in acceleration, but across entire laps. And that kind of consistency doesn't come from one advantage. It comes from a system, a complete package working in harmony. Which leads to a much deeper question. Was the compression trick just the beginning? Or was it the foundation of something far more advanced? Because Ferrari realized something that changed their entire approach. Even if the FIA fixed the compression rule, that wouldn't erase what Mercedes had already built. It would only remove one layer. And if there are more layers, then the real gap hasn't even been exposed yet. That's why this situation became so dangerous. Because now Ferrari isn't just chasing performance. They're chasing understanding, trying to reverse engineer something they didn't see coming. And in Formula One, that's the worst position to be in, because by the time you understand it, you're already behind. And the most unsettling part? Mercedes hasn't shown any signs of slowing down, which suggests something very simple. They were ready for this, long before anyone else realized what was happening. And that raises one final question that nobody in the paddock can ignore anymore. If this was discovered now, how long has it really been there? But then something happened after Japan that changed the entire tone inside Ferrari. Because up to that point, this was a theory. A very strong one, supported by data, backed by logic, but still a theory. And in Formula One, theory is not enough. You need proof. You need patterns. You need something that cannot be explained any other way. And that's exactly what started to appear. Not in the engine specs, not in official reports, but in telemetry. Silent data, the kind that doesn't lie and doesn't care about politics. Engineers began comparing race traces, straight line speeds, energy deployment, harvest cycles, corner exits, and at first, nothing seemed completely abnormal. Mercedes was fast, but they've always been fast. That alone wasn't enough. But then they looked deeper, not at peak performance, but at consistency. And that's where everything broke. Because Mercedes wasn't just faster at certain points. They were more efficient everywhere, lap after lap, sector after sector, with a level of stability that didn't match a single advantage. It matched a system working perfectly. And this is where Ferrari found something they weren't even looking for. Energy recovery, the MGUK system. Something that, on paper, should be tightly limited, highly regulated, almost identical across teams. But in reality, it wasn't. Because Mercedes was harvesting more energy per lap. Not slightly more. Significantly more. Enough to create a gap that couldn't be ignored. And here's why that matters. More harvested energy means more deployment. More deployment means more power for longer periods. Which means the car isn't just fast once. It stays fast. Again, and again, and again. And suddenly, the original question comes back, but in a much more dangerous form. What if the compression trick isn't the main advantage? What if it's feeding something bigger? Because higher compression means higher efficiency. Higher efficiency means more usable energy. And that energy has to go somewhere. Into the hybrid system. Into deployment. Into lap time. And now everything starts to connect. The engine. The heat. The expansion. The energy recovery. This isn't one innovation. It's a chain reaction. A perfectly linked system where one gain amplifies another. And Ferrari realized something that changed the entire investigation. They weren't chasing a trick. They were chasing an ecosystem, a design philosophy that turns small advantages into dominant performance. And here's the part that makes this even more unsettling. None of this is clearly illegal. There's no single component you can point at and say, that's the problem. Because every piece individually follows the rules. But together, they create something the rules never anticipated. And that's the real danger. Because how do you regulate something that isn't one thing? How do you stop an advantage that exists in the interaction between systems? That's the dilemma the FIA now faces. And it explains why their response wasn't immediate punishment. It was hesitation. It was negotiation. It was delay. Because the moment they act, they're not just judging Mercedes. They're admitting the regulations failed. And in Formula One, that's a much bigger problem. But here's where the tension reaches its peak. Because all of this leads to one unavoidable moment. A deadline. A line that cannot be avoided anymore. June. That's when everything changes. That's when engines will finally be tested under real conditions. No more gaps. No more interpretation. Just reality. And that moment will answer the one question every team is waiting for. Not publicly, but desperately. Because if Mercedes loses performance, then Ferrari was right. But if they don't, then this story is far from over. In fact, it's only just beginning.